while we're waiting, might as well just cut it down, get dirty. It is deep dark chocolate. No one is. But because it's not good, I'm going to take the first piece because it's just tradition, right? Okay. No, that's okay. I'll forego this cream. Yeah. That's all right. Slide it down, you guys. You take what you want. There is a secret ingredient in it. I hope you guys are. Let's say it doesn't make anyone drunk. It just puts a little flavor into it. So, yeah, there you go. Take what you want. All right, let's see. This meeting is being live streamed. Hi guys. Hi guys. So happy birthday. I do like I was telling them, I love deep dark chocolate with a chocolate cake.
There you go.
And yeah, I'm glad you were able. I'll wait on attendance for a bit. Because you can't have chocolate without something. I couldn't bring coffee. So, well, I could have stopped at Dunkin' Donuts and got one, but both of them do it. But there's water in the kitchen, so I'll cut some. Anyway. All right. So how we don't have anyone at home?
Hey, how are you?
Let's do this. I am going to, so far there's nobody on, why don't I just go ahead and share this thing? And when new people come in, see them. So, we'll wait a few minutes. I can start, I guess, with in attendance. First of all, guys, Christ is risen. We have to start with that always during this pastoral season. And before we begin, I guess we'll say Christ is risen. We won't sing it. We could sing it. Let's see this first though, in terms of. So I know Athena's not here. Alex, who's Alex? Do we have an Alex? No. Let's see. Augusta's here. Let's see. Get the right date with that. Okay. And John. And then Maria Gall. Nope, right. Andrew Gall. Nope. Sam Hall. Okay. Teddy, forgive me guys, I don't know all your name. They might ring a bell, but they might not. John I've known for many, many years. So but anyway. Teddy, that's you. Okay, there we go. And no, do we have Nico Kiriakou? No. Okay, Mary, no, Mary Makers, no. Erica. Oh, no. Okay. Okay, well, let's see. Lauren W, there you are. Okay. Down there. So then the only other person I have, Jolene. Why would Jolene? Okay. I don't know why a couple of these people aren't. Really?
Yeah.
Jolene?
No.
Oh, Pat.
Yeah.
Okay. Whatever. That's all. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, okay. So are you Ryan or Jeremiah? Ryan, okay. Glad to have your board. Oh, I should silence that, shouldn't I? So help yourself to some comfort, right? Hello. Okay. All right. Well, And we'll welcome new people as we come on board. Well, as we get started, it's already a few minutes after, so I'll just do the prayer. Christ is risen. Christ is risen from the dead, by death trampling upon death, and to those in the tombs bestowing life. All right, so we have come to the conclusion of the course, but today's class is going to be more historical and, I don't know if you will, sociological, organizational, less theological than any of the other classes that you had. Because today we're going to look at what is this complexity of things that we call the jurisdictional problem. And okay. And in particular, we come to understand something about how orthodoxy has manifested itself here in the United States, in America, and its challenges, its possibilities, its future, etc. The situation in North America in particular, well, South America as well, but North America is the test case, if you will, for a way in which orthodoxy has come to be that was never anywhere else in the world in terms of how it came to manifest itself, be lived, grow, and for people to participate in. It didn't follow any of the canonical norms or the process. It tried to, but historical factors complicated that process. So we'll look at it. However, the church in the Reformed Church in America has been planted, and one of the factors to recognize it as ready to be recognized as an independent church and no longer a dependent or daughter church is whether or not saints have been recognized who live and worked in North America. And indeed, we have a number of saints already recognized and a few more being recognized. But as you'll see, there's one there that's called St. John of Chicago up in the second from your left, I guess. Yeah. And then there's St. Madaria of Libertyville. That one, please don't fall. Okay, that's the bishop in the second tier. And in fact, we have his relics up in Libertyville, about 30 minutes from here, about 30 minutes. As you see, there are a few others, St. Raphael of Brooklyn, and a few others, and we will talk about many of these. Just ignore that. Obviously, I didn't kill the library. This is a list that's growing. Interestingly enough, there are no Greek Orthodox in that bunch. They are Russian. There's one from the Antiochian or Lebanese tradition. There's several from the Serbian tradition. There's a native Alaskan in there, St. Peter the Alut. But so far we have not lifted up. Yet that doesn't mean that they haven't been holy people who are Greek Orthodox. And in fact, we have advocated for a particular person who our own Presbyterian Mary Skoulas knew personally very well, and I knew as well, but I didn't know as well as she did, to be recognized as a saint. He was a wonderful person and God. So what's behind this? Well, in order to understand what's happened here and also orthodoxy around the world, you really have to understand something about the historical journey of the church in the regions that the Eastern Church had taken root and had flourished. And the vast majority of those regions came under Islamic rule. In the Middle East, under different caliphs, and in the certain other areas, Arabic tribes, but for a vast portion of the world inhabited by Orthodox peoples, it was the Ottoman Turks. Okay, and what we see here is the darker color, that's how extensive the Ottoman Empire was. I mean, honestly, in some ways it rivaled and expanded even beyond what the Roman Empire didn't completely correspond to the Roman Empire, but it was vast. Modern day Turkey itself is actually a very small portion of it. That's the lighter colored rose up there. The Byzantine Empire, which was the previous empire to rule the area, was also very expansive at one time, but not this big. And by the time it was conquered by the Ottoman Turks, it had really shrunk to just a small region around Constantinople and a few other pockets, some in Greece, some in a couple other areas. This encompassed places that were not just Greek, but as you can see, Alexandria, Damascus, Jerusalem, these were places that were Orthodox, but under various other patriarchs, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Patriarch of Alexandria. Damascus was the seat of the Patriarch of Antioch. There was a Patriarch of Constantinople, but honestly, now all of those patriarchates, all four of them, are under Ottoman rule. And you go up to where the Serbians had been evangelized. The Serbian Christian were Orthodox, and they were all now, and the Armenian and Georgian and Bulgarian and Albanian, all these places came under Ottoman rule. This had a tremendous impact on the church, because although the Turks came in with the attitude that the Orthodox people are not heretics, not pagans, and there was a position taken by many of the Turks that you could not be a pagan and be in the empire. You had to convert or die. That was it. But for Christians and Jews, they were considered people of the book, and they were allowed to exist. They were considered misguided, wrong about certain things, but at least they believed in one God. Well, they weren't so sure about Christians believing in one God, but they honored Jesus Christ quite a bit in the Quran and the Mother of God. They didn't see that he was God, but they respected him. So they gave certain respect to the Christians, and they allowed them to continue to practice their faith, but under extremely limited conditions. So these were some of the conditions. Number one, legally, they were not able to advocate for themselves on equal status with Muslims. So it usually would take 3 Christians to 1 Muslim's work. It couldn't, if it was 1-to-1, the Muslim always won. They had to wear distinctive dress. They could never ride in a position that was higher, so that they could not ride horseback. They always had to walk or be on a donkey or something. There was just a lot of rules like that. And there were a lot of incentives. They weren't allowed to work, to be in the army, which had certain kinds of advancements. They had very restricted positions in the government, etc. In terms of practicing their faith, they were allowed to worship, but every new structure or the repair of old structures had to be approved. And over time, if you don't approve it and you don't allow for new structures, the churches crumble, right? They didn't allow education of children or of priests, new priests. So the children, if they were to be educated, had to be educated in secret at night. And there are many Greek poems about going to catechism class by moonlight. We sing these things. The seminary students had to leave their homeland and go west to Western Christian territories to study their faith in order to become theologians, which was a problem because we were in schism with the West at this point. Christianity fell, the Byzantine Empire fell to Islam in 1453. the schism between the East and the West had happened in 1054, so it already had been going on for several hundred years. And so there were all of these stresses. Even more problematic, okay? The Ottoman Empire used something called the millet system in order to govern its peoples who were not Turks or Muslims. What they did is they identified, okay, in the Ottoman Turk mind, there was no distinction between religious identity and national identity. The true Turk was Muslim. If you were Greek, you were Christian, and they combined the two. They believed that all the Orthodox Christians were under one ethnic umbrella, and they were to be ruled by this ethnarch. He's not just a patriarch, he's not just in charge of the church, he's not in charge of a political group only, he was in charge of this unit, which was called millet, and it was a confessional community, but they had to operate like a governmental structure as well, which means they had to collect taxes, which they then, we're talking about the priests and the bishops, okay, had to collect taxes, which they then paid to the caliph, right, to the sultan. So what you ended up with is and they used the structures of the church to implement these various systems. And so the church structures became political structures. And with politics came corruption, because influence could be bought to settle cases, if there was taxes, there would be pressure to overtax and then keep some. In addition, all the hierarchs were invested with their position by the Turkish government, by the Ottoman Turkish government. And today in modern Turkey, in fact, the patriarch still receives his official authorization from the Turkish government, which is incredible anomaly, of course, for a church operating. What that meant, oh yes, and the patriarch had to pay something called the barat, for a certain fee. Here you have Sultan Muhammad II, and giving investing the patriarch with his authorization, Patriarch Navius Scholarius. This was the very first time this happened. Muhammad II, Sultan Muhammad II, was the one who conquered Constantinople, and Navius Scholarius was the first patriarch under that sultan, and this commemorates that. So this ethnarch was a religious hierarch, and they thought of all the Orthodox under the Greeks. If you recall that other map, all those other people now came under the ecumenical patriarch. So in a way, his scope and power just vastly increased. But the other patriarchs almost disappeared for a while. And in fact, the churches of Serbia, Bulgaria, of Georgia, they did disappear. They did disappear, and some others. Benefits? Well, one of the benefits actually of the system was that when you so closely identify the culture and the people, you actually find a way to help the people retain their religion and retain their cultural identity. In other words, this millet system sort of facilitated the perpetuation of these subunits instead of blending them in and integrating them into the wider culture. So instead of having the melting pot effect, where you would end up with, kind of a uniform, you really ended up with a stew, right? With distinct, groups maintaining their identity over 400 years. So the millet system actually ultimately backfired on the Ottoman Turks, because by enabling it to keep that close association of, who I am as a people, as the Ottoman Empire began to crack, these subgroups began to fight for their independence. And in fact, in the 19th century, this is when the big wars of freedom occurred. The Greeks began their freedom in 1821. Took a few years, but as each of these states pulled away out of the Ottoman Empire and were established as independent countries, their churches emerged out of this big uniform collective and reestablished themselves as independent Orthodox churches. Now you're going to say, what does that have to do with America? But all this has everything to do with America, ultimately. But first, remember what's going on through this process is this intense identification of ethnic identity and religion. Okay, to be Greek is to be Orthodox, be Orthodox is to be Greek. With that comes language. You have to maintain your language to maintain your identity, separate from this big melting pot group, etc. Your customs, etc. As you can see in this chart, there were several movements to recognize the other patriarchates. Now, you'll see some of them say, like Orthodox Church of Greece, established 1833, recognized 1850. What does that mean? It took, in many cases, several years, maybe decades, for the ecumenical patriarch to say, oh, you're on your own, okay? You're no longer under our rule, because that began to cut away at his authority, his territory, his protection too, in a way, because the more people that you have under you gives you a status and a protection from the Turkish authorities. Just to underscore how clearly the church was identified with the nation by the Ottoman Turks. When the Greeks rebelled and began the Greek War of Independence, the patriarch was dragged from his residence and hung at the gates of the patriarchate as a sign to the people that their rebellion would not be tolerated. It was the patriarch, even though that particular patriarch hadn't been active in instigating. He had not been compliant in instigating the rebellion. However, there were a lot of monks and priests in the mainland of Greece who, in fact, were a part of the resistance and part of the War of Independence. My husband's family is from the Peloponnesus. You can't go there without being shown by the monks, we had the cannons hiding stuff. I'm like, I don't know about this. You're monks, you're not supposed to say cannons, but that's a whole other issue. Okay. All right. There are still some contested churches, partly because the ecumenical patriarch, well, the last three, the ecumenical patriarch doesn't recognize the Orthodox Church in America. The Russian patriarch does not recognize the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And the Serbian, I think actually the Macedonian Orthodox Church, I think they've, like within the last 3 months, I think they've made peace and they're recognized, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Okay. And now we're going to take a look at how we have the journey to America. There are 2 major pathways. By the way, I'm assuming there's nobody at home. They would show up, I think. I hate to pause this for a minute, so I really should. Let me just check my the PowerPoint. Let's see. Stop the share for a second. Nope. Nope. Okay. Go back to this. Share. Start this up again. Okay. So interestingly enough, although we just don't think about these people, the first Orthodox to live and stay in America. I'm not talking about there were a couple of there was a in the 18th century, 1760 something. There were Greeks that came from the end of the Peloponnese and that tried to establish a place in Florida. It didn't work at all. Most of them died or ended up in St. Augustine, but they didn't do any kind of church structures at all. The first church life and structure actually came via the explorers and traders from Russia. And after they came in the late 18th century, 1780s, 90s, they recognized the need to have missionaries because their merchants, their traders were staying on the land and marrying Alaskan Aleutian women or interacting with the populace, and they thought, let's make this Orthodox. Let's bring the Russian monks. And so we'll see how a group of Russian monks actually traveled a tremendous distance to begin missionizing the far northwest Alaskan territories. But of course, the second main way that we all know and love so well is how Orthodoxy came via the immigrants, and they brought it with them. So we'll talk about these two different pathways. At first, they operated, and I'm thinking East Coast, West Coast, because really what was happening on the far northwest coast of America, people on the East Coast, which is where immigrants came in, they had no clue what was going over there, and they didn't really know what was going over here, but they did intersect. Come mid 18th century and certainly by the 19th century, those two movements had begun to intersect. It's a unique process. You have no other place really on earth at that time where this was happening. Now, later you will see immigrants, for example, going into Australia, but you don't have the concurrent missionization through a monastic missionary presence. So there are a couple of places that are similar, but not really the same. Some people say, well, what about Western Europe? But, Western Europe, of course, already had Christian presence there. So the movement of Orthodox into those areas was not the same as this. It had similarities because it came through immigrants primarily, but it's not identical. Okay. Well, kind of a helpful map to show where the missionaries first came, and ultimately they came down the West Coast and did establish a diocese in San Francisco. And we'll talk about this in a second. The move from immigrants, of course, through New York, that's how most people know it, but Orthodox immigrants also came very in large numbers to New Orleans, because there were a lot of the Greeks were seafaring people, and they liked the territories of Florida and Louisiana to deal with fish and trading. Later on in the late 19th, early 20th century, the mining territories were settled by Slavic Orthodox people. So you see a heavy concentration there. Okay, so missionaries bringing the Orthodox faith to the New World. The really truly remarkable heroic journey was made in 1794 by 8 monks who traveled 7,327 miles over 293 days. And you have to remember, they didn't have cars, right? This was either by foot or by animal, and then ultimately by boat to bring Orthodoxy to the Alaskan territories. Unfortunately, the Russian rulers at the time were extremely cruel. The ones that were in Alaska, they were basically, they were businessmen who were there to turn the highest profit, and they treated the native people very poorly. The monks were aghast. They were horrified. And when most of them returned to Russia in order to be given further power in order to combat. So they needed their ranks to be raised, to be a bishop, to be a hierarch, in order to be able to command the Russian merchants to operate differently. And in fact, Joseph in 1799, he was consecrated bishop for Alaska, but he died in a shipwreck on the way back. And there were just a few left. One in particular was a man of great holiness and very beloved of the Alaskan people. And he had really, there was no way he could control the Russian merchants, but he did retreat to Spruce Island. And there he opened up schools for children. It was a refuge for the native people. They came and they visited him. You can still go to the place where he had his hut. Now there's a church, but he is now recognized as a saint, very beloved saint. He passed in 1887. The next important thing that happened was in 1824, a priest, Father John Vyaminov, and his wife and his children came to Unalaska, Alaska, and he was just on fire missionary. He used to take canoes and hike through islands and all kinds of different kinds of weather to bring the gospel, to baptize, to educate. He started to translate the gospel and the liturgy into okay. And that ours? No. Who was that person? She wasn't there. I'm only worried because there was supposed to be a parish council meeting tonight, but I don't think they were on the premises. So I don't think Aaliyah is on anymore. Yeah, that's a pizza, right? I didn't just want to double check it, but I'm okay. Oh, North Branch. Huh. Okay. But that's typical parish councils. All right. We'll look at it on break. I don't know. I want to keep moving. I don't know what to say. There's no, I thought maybe somebody left me a text about it. But, maybe I should text Leah and say so she can. Guys. Okay. All right. So John began to do what Orthodox are supposed to do when they missionize new territory, when they come to new territory, translate the services into the language of the people. I say that, and he did that. He started to translate into Aleutian, and he learned the language. And I say that because that's not what happened when the immigrants came. They did the opposite, right? They worked really hard to retain their language. So now you have a conflicting method of how you express your faith in the new land, right? Okay. He was eager to educate and ordain native priests. And so there was a native priest ordained in 1825. And then, hey, that's not ours, right? I thought so, Tommy. Is that basketball? What is it? Parish council? Goya. Goya. Okay.
Oh, good.
Well, yeah, I did bake a chocolate cake if you guys want. If you want a piece, you're welcome to it, Tommy. It's my birthday. That's why I baked the cake. Thank you. Thank you. I had a momentary thought that perhaps somebody, because a number of people knew I was teaching tonight. Maybe somebody would surprise them. No, it's okay. It's all right. Thank you, guys. All right. His wife passed away. And at that point, though, that Orthodox bishops actually can be married, but they cannot be married at the time that they are consecrated as bishops. Their wife has to have passed away, or in ancient times, it would be acceptable if both entered monastic life. In fact, there was a metropolitan here a Serbian metropolitan here in Chicago, who passed away in like 2008 or so. It was a grandfather because he had been married, and then when his wife died, he was elevated to bishop and then metropolitan. So he became a bishop, and he was the first bishop to actually oversee this new diocese that's being formed. First, it was just a, like an outpost, right? But eventually, by 1870, it was actually given the official title of diocese. I say that because canonically, once there's a diocese in a new country, the territory should be governed by the church in which the diocese occurs. So it is a Russian mission. It was under the Russians. The diocese was run by the Russians. And so in terms of the canons or rules of the church, from that perspective, there are other things that come in, but from that perspective, one could make the argument that the ruling hierarchs of the church in America should be Russian. Okay. And if we were to become an autocephalous church, that would be how that would operate. But history had a lot of other things in store, right? So this particular guy, Innocent, actually ends up going back to Russia and becomes the Metropolitan of Moscow. At that time, there was no Patriarch of Moscow because the Tsars had eliminated the Patriarchate and they're only metropolitans. So he actually at that point held the highest position of the Russian hierarchy. The guy who'd come to the US and, got in the canoes with the translated things into the others. And yes, he is recognized. You'll see, I think, his icon in a bit. But he is recognized as enlightener of America and as a saint. A lot was undertaken by this Russian diocese and mission. First it's a mission and then it's a diocese. They started a mission school. They started a seminary in Sitka, Alaska. They consecrated a cathedral. There's the cathedral, built between 1844 and 1848. They started the first official parish before the ones started by the Greeks. I'll tell you, the first one was in 1868 that was in U.S. territory at that point. It wasn't a state, but it was U.S. territory in San Francisco. And then it became an actual diocese in 1870. And here are some other photos of, the Russian priests with the native people in front of the various structures that they used to worship. That cathedral in Alaska in 1887, now today, St. Michael's Cathedral in 2007. By the time that Alaska was sold to America in 1867, there were 12,000 native Christians, 9 parishes, 35 chapels, 17 schools, 4 orphanages. the last week of Lent, I spoke at St. Nectaria's Church about a native woman. Her name is Olga of Alaska. And she's being promoted. People are asking that she be recognized as a saint. She died in the late 60s, 1960s. So we have photographs and all that. She was a grandmother of 8, etc. But at the conclusion of the lecture, one of the parishioners came up to me and said, "Did I hear right? Are there Native Americans who are Orthodox?" And I said, "Oh my goodness, that's because nobody in the wider Orthodox population, very few know about all this history, right?" Yes, there are. There were and there are. So, and here was an Orthodox wedding party. And this is an interior church. This is not in one of the big cities, but in one of the interiors. I'm going to shift gears because this is all happening now, 1860, 1870. We're moving into a time when something else is happening. Right? That's when you begin to see the flux of Orthodox Christians coming in through the waves of immigration. So we have Ellis Island, this particular, this bar here a little bit. In 1892, between 1870 and 1910, more than 25 million immigrants arrived in the United States. I mean, obviously they're not all Orthodox. There's a good percentage that are Orthodox, okay? So, and what you have down here is this congregation is in Louisiana, and it was actually the first Greek Orthodox parish established, and Orthodox parish in America, apart from the one I told you about in San Francisco, okay, and in Sitka. So this is the first Greek Orthodox, but at that time, basically anybody who was Orthodox went to those churches because they didn't have any other options, okay? And this particular photo is from 1911, but the church was established in the late 1800s, I think around 1892 or something. So what did the immigrants find when they got here? Nothing, nothing. There were no priests, there were no churches for them, there were no schools. The immigrants did it all. This is another thing you have to remember, that the church didn't send its structures and its hierarchs, and didn't even send its priests first or missionaries first. First came the immigrants, and then they would write home and say, "Please send us a priest, because we bought the property." So what do? They raised the funds. They're like, "We want a place to worship. We want to raise our children Orthodox. We have to buy a structure." Usually they would buy a Protestant church or a hall or something like that. Sometimes they would build it, but in the beginning, the best they could do was to buy a storefront or something like that. But the parishioners, the lay people, owned it, right? They had to form like little corporations. This is unheard of in Orthodoxy. This was not how the church operated in the home worlds back in Greece and Serbia and Albania, right? It's different. They wrote home begging for their clergy. Who are they going to write to? They don't know anything about the Russian diocese. They wrote back to where they came from. If the Greeks, some of them wrote back to Greeks from the homeland in Greece. Others who came from Turkey wrote back and said to the ecumenical patriarch, "Send us somebody." The Serbs did the same thing, etc. And then they had to build structures, both internally and physically, okay? So the internal structure would be parish boards and councils, associations, to collect funds, to administer the funds. They began their religious education programs. Again, you didn't have teachers and priests from Greece or whatever, almost nothing. So you'd get their smartest people or their best educated people or somebody who knew something about something and started the educational programs, established their choirs. We didn't have chanters here. How are you going to sing the hymns? The people did the best they could with the choirs. They had philanthropic groups. The women's philanthropic groups were established, youth groups, and a lot of programs to enable the new immigrants to sort of get a foothold and step into this world. And the focus was really within this ethnic group. There was no looking out to the wider culture. Right? The church really was focused on taking care of its own group, and they purchased land for cemeteries. This begins, though, to give the lay people, it changed the balance of how decisions were made in the Christian Orthodox community. How decisions were made, how, if you will, power is exercised. If they basically invited a priest to come and they didn't like him, told him to leave. Okay, there was no bishop here to decide who was going to be the priest of each parish, and there was no bishop to appeal to if the priest was being treated poorly. And so there was a lot of what we would call now sort of what Orthodox see it as is sort of a Protestant way of behaving in the way of how churches are operated, that the congregation, the people, the parish board would make the decisions for the life of the church. But it wasn't because they were trying to be Protestant. It's because the necessities of the historical circumstances basically thrust them into that position. And then that's how it worked. It took a long time. Ultimately, eventually, the church structures came into place. But as we'll see, it took decades. And then you had to retrain parishioners how to interface with and interact with their priests and their hierarchs. Now, you guys, we are past this now, okay? But in my parents' day, my parents were all born here. My grandparents were all from either Greece or Constantinople. And yes, it was called Constantinople when they lived there, because Constantinople didn't change to Istanbul until the 1920s, just so you all know. But the reality is, this was very much an issue when I was a child growing up. You know, it wasn't until probably the 80s and 90s and 2000s that you began to see the structure that we have now with the hierarchs, you know, making decisions as to priest placement and the greater deference of parish councils to the priest being the main person to organize and direct the parish. Okay, that took a lot of time to shift. It's still not the same as it is in the old country, and maybe it never will be, because we live here in America and we have different ways of organizing ourselves and speaking up and, you know, sharing ideas, etc. All right, I'm going to just say the Russian diocese is trying to become a real diocese. Okay, so keeps working at it. One of the things it did, and I gotta give the Russian diocese at the time a lot of credit, it envisioned itself as a multi-ethnic, multicultural diocese. It understood that America was not going to be just Russian by any means. Something happened in addition. There were a whole bunch of Eastern Rite Catholics that came into the Orthodox Church through the agency of this man, St. Alexis taught. Not going to get into that, it's really complicated, but through his agency, through his work, some 20,000 Eastern Rite Catholics returned to the Russian Orthodox Church. And after his death, eventually about 100,000. Eastern Rite Catholics, Eastern Rite Catholics they look like an Orthodox church, but they're under the Pope. That's the best way I can explain it. And among them were mainly or mostly Ukrainian. And it had to do with the political situation of that region. Part of what the Russian diocese was doing was recognizing that there are ethnic groups within the American life landscape that needed their own sort of hierarch who would be under the Russian big hierarch, okay? And so they facilitated that by having ethnic priests who then they were ordained to higher positions. And the first bishop who was actually ordained in the United States was in 1904. Or he was Lebanese. He came, he basically administered to the Arab-speaking Orthodox. He was under the Russian hierarch, but ministering to the Syrian and Arabic community, Arabic Orthodox communities. And he did tremendous work. And he is recognized as a saint. Saint Raphael of Brooklyn. The Serbians had a tremendous support and guide and counselor and priest to care for them under the person of Saint Sebastian of San Francisco in Jackson, California. And again, he was not in the Serbian diocese. There was no Serbian diocese. He was under the Russian diocese. And he was raised to the rank of archimandrite, which is not bishop, but it's still high. And he ministered to that group too. At that point, the idea was that this Russian diocese will not actually, as it grew, would no longer be Russian, it would be American, in that it would minister to all the people in America. All right. In 1905, the person who led it was Archbishop Tikhon. And he envisioned this one unified and ultimately autocephalous, independent Orthodox Church in America. But under it, under this one, you'd have the Greeks, and you'd have the Serbs, and you'd have the Arabs, or you'd have parishes that would just speak in English and be American. He was bishop here for a while. He actually was bishop in Chicago, but ultimately he went back to Russia. He became, remember I told you that the patriarchate was abolished by the czars? Well, when the Russian Revolution hit, just on the eve of that, they reestablished the patriarchate. This guy, Tikhon, who had been here in Chicago, became the patriarch of Moscow. And then under Soviet rule, he was imprisoned, suffered tremendously, and ultimately died. And he has been recognized as a saint and enlightener of America. And one of the things he said, it was just to show in 1905, all right, the diocese is not only multinational, it's composed of several Orthodox churches. He had this vision, right, which keep the unity of faith. So Orthodox jurisdictions all share unity of faith and unity in sacraments, but diversity in expression, culture, language, music, etc. Preserve their peculiarities, their own sort of self-expression in canonical structure and liturgical rules in parish life. These peculiarities are dear to them and can perfectly well be tolerated in the pan-Orthodox scene. We do not consider that we have the right to suppress the national character of the churches here. On the contrary, we try to preserve this character, etc. We recognize that life in the New World is different from that in the Old. Autonomy and possibly autocephaly should be granted to the Church in America. I say that because 100 and almost 20 years ago, there was a vision for an independent, self-governing, united Orthodox Church in America, which is not what we have. But it doesn't mean it won't happen. All right. I'll get us up to the revolution and then we'll break. Okay. The second decade of the 20th century, however, began to see some things crumbling. Part of that was stuff was going on in Greece, stuff was going on with the Ottoman Turks. The Ottoman Turks were facing a lot of stress. They were putting stress on the populations, on the Greek populations in their territories. And some of that came spilling out into America. But you do see in this period of time the beginning of restlessness by the immigrants to have their own ethnic jurisdictions. They still really don't know who this Russian diocese is, really not convinced about it. And they're thinking maybe we should have our own Greek diocese and our own Serbian diocese. It hasn't happened yet, but this is what you begin to see in this particular second. And then everything goes bad. Okay. With the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian diocese here was completely cut off from its mother church. Funding, guidance, support. Many of the hierarchs who had served and had gone back to Russia were imprisoned or killed. And they couldn't even figure out how they were going to function as a church without a patriarch, without hierarchs, because they didn't have the authority to be independent here. And with the Russian Revolution, you end up actually with the Russian church splintering into 4 different manifestations. And we'll talk about the 2 main ones that show up in the US at that time. But the other Orthodox churches see this, and they recognize that they in no way can depend on the bishops or the authority of the Russian. So now they really have to set up their own administrative structures. In addition, it's not just a revolution, but there's also the First World War, and that has lots of different outcomes too. And so that has set those mother countries into different positions now with regard to the people that they're trying to care for who are not in their mother countries. I'll just highlight the ones in red, and then we're going to take our break. One of the things that the Russians did, Tikhon, who was patriarch, recognized that those people were adrift, who are not in the Russian territory. And so he authorized them temporarily to function independently. That was rescinded later by later patriarchs, but different groups got established through that. Of the most important for the US were these 2, ROKOR, the Russian church outside of Russia, which had a very decidedly royalist tendency to it. In fact, they actually advocated for the reestablishment of the Romanov dynasty. So they were royalists, very anti-communist, very traditionalist. And they broke with the Moscow Patriarch entirely. And actually, they were only in communion with the Serbians for a very, very long time. They're very traditionalist. If you saw Orthodox who had, the women had coverings and and it would just be a very traditional Orthodox church. It would either be the Serbs or ROKOR. However, ROKOR, over the many, many decades of the 20th century, ultimately have made peace with the Moscow Patriarch. And in 2006 or 7, they were back in communion. And once they're back in communion with the Moscow Patriarch, at the time, Moscow was in communion with all the other Orthodox, so they became in communion with all the other. Okay. The second big thing to note is 1922, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese got founded. That's what this church belongs to. And that was a big, big deal because the Greeks are the elephant in the room. They're by far the most numerous. They're the best funded. They have a lot of money, a lot of authority, a lot of voice, a lot of people, and became very much a predominant element in American society. And then the next group that you should notice is the Metropolia. The Metropolia was another Russian group here, which maintained ties with the Moscow Patriarch while operating independently. They didn't officially break. They still kept dialogue. And in 1970, they were given their independence to become an autocephalous church, their own government governing church. And they are the OCA, the Orthodox Church of America. That's the Metropolia. And then the other people I put up are the Serbs because I do this PowerPoint for my Serbian class and they need to know when we don't have to talk about that. But the Serbs, the Romanians, they all start establishing their own dioceses. All right, let's take a break. 5-6 minutes, walk around. So I will. All right, let's put this on. I'm just gonna leave it up. Water. You did.
Up there, 'cause you
Really?
got a daughter, right?
I did actually
Yeah.
3 daughters, but
I'm 34.
that was Elaine.
Elaine, that's
Yeah, that's Elaine. Elaine's in Albuquerque now.
awesome.
You know, 2 of my 3 daughters I live in Albuquerque, but yeah. Call Elaine my wild child because she actually, yeah, so was she.
There you go.
There you go. There you go. Well, that's, yeah, and your name again is Ken. Okay. Cassius. I still remember Cassius. The family. Okay.
Well, there's a church in there now, but
In Ascension. Yeah, that's a great church. I think I mentioned that. I teach Bible study up there too. It's a great community. So. And it goes really good. Pardon me? It's near the Bible.
What's the last name?
Hi, Father. How are you?
Good, how you doing?
Good. It's great to go good.
Oh,
Yeah, very happy.
right. How are you? I don't know. That's your last class.
Yeah, but
So I'll be sending out, did I already send out the evaluation?
I think you done.
So, yeah, just make sure you fill out the evaluation. Helpful for us. Better.
I think it was great. You know,
the certificate.
So what I do, so you get their assumption.
Yeah.
So what I do is I assign it, and I do it, obviously, he
Oh,
sends it.
okay, cool.
Whatever it is, and you have.
No, not yet. I have to process that one.
Whatever it is, doesn't have it.
Yeah. Sounds
Okay. Oh, have a good night.
good. Yeah, you too. Yep.
Take it. Yeah. Hey, you're in all right. Yeah, it's only. I didn't know what to say.
He was around here. He was
Well, no, you're good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which squad, sorry.
Yeah.
Which squad don't forget you about.
Oh.
Wait, so how
Thank you.
So let me pause for a second and ask if there are questions yet. I mean, I realize there's a lot of history getting thrown at you, but we're not familiar with questions with our own history here in the US, and it does explain kind of why we are. So anyway, if there's questions along the way, interrupt me, ask, or, that's cool. That's it. So along with the establishment of the jurisdictions, we have now people being ordained as bishops. Saint Medarea is the first bishop. This is the guy here. Oh, that is not okay. Huh? No. What has happened here? Sometimes it's, the link in this quarter. Oh, that's it.
Oh, good.
But it's the hole to put the thing in is not, it's too big. It falls out. Let's see here. I told them about it and told them about it. And, nobody's done anything about it. Okay. Now. Okay. Okay. Let's go back here. Yeah. Okay. So Saint Medarea, still there here. Very epically, he used his own funds to help build the first church up in Libertyville, and he would ride his bicycle from Chicago to Libertyville to minister there. And I mean, he laid the bricks with his own hand. He died at the age of 45 of tuberculosis. But this is showing you some of the structures that they established. That church up there is the monastery church of St. Sava. That's the one that he built, with his own hands, the bricks he put up there, etc. The photo of these people down at the bottom is where they're consecrating the property where that monastery and church has been built. And by the way, you should go visit it. It's got gorgeous iconography. It's really well worth visiting. It's not far at all. It's very close. Miranda Anderson lives really close there. So basically, since we're Greek Orthodox, I just put in a few slides that kind of lay out how the Greek Orthodox archdiocese got founded and progressed. But essentially, there was a huge, massive amount of immigration. Parishes in New York, Chicago, and Massachusetts were established. You have the diocese getting established in 1922, but there was a back and forth because we were under the Church of Greece. First we were under the Ecumenical Patriarch, then we were under the Church of Greece, and we came back under the Ecumenical Patriarch, and that had all to do with politics back in Greece, and I'm not going to get into it. But it was emblematic of the problem that the churches experienced here, because they would write back to their homelands for assistance, direction, guidance, etc. What was going on in their homelands always impacted the churches here. And every single ethnic church experienced some divisions over the next 50 years. The Greeks split and came back together again. The Serbians split and came back together. And when you have churches here in like the Chicagoland area split, you have a division of resources. I mean, there's scarce resources as it is, right? And then they're fighting. I mean, it didn't allow for enough, growth and consolidation. So those things had to be settled. And part of that was just gaining some distance from the homeland struggles, which were political, and they had to do with, in Greece, for example, the struggle was between those who supported the king, who was ultimately deposed, and those who did not support the king, wanted a democratic government. Part of the problem was the king's wife was German and related to the German emperor, and World War I hit, and okay. But the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese started to really get their act in order. And one of the things they did in the 20s is they adopted the new calendar, not the old calendar. So they went to the Gregorian, not the Julian calendar, but only for what we call the fixed feasts. Did anyone talk to you guys about calendar and fixed feast and movable feasts? Okay. So the calendar that the church used from day one was the one under the Roman Empire, the Julian calendar for Julius Caesar. But the fact of the matter is that calendar was operating with incorrect scientific calculations of the changes of the moon and the sun, okay, and when the vernal equinox, the spring equinox would occur, etc. It was a bad calendar. It needed to be reformed. Under Pope Gregory in the 17th century, the Western world reformed their calendar, basically shifted everything by about 11 days, okay, back. And over the centuries, it actually is a pretty good calendar. In other words, it follows pretty well the best scientific understanding of how the seasons operate. So you still are having spring and springtime, etc. The Julian calendar over centuries kept losing time. So now it is actually 13 days apart from the Gregorian calendar, which means that May 1st, it's already May 13th on the new calendar, the Gregorian calendar, when it's May 1st on the Julian calendar. Now you think, oh, what's the big deal? Well, there are certain feasts of the church that are fixed. They always happen on the same day every year. Christmas is a perfect example. It's December 25th. It can be a Monday, a Tuesday, a Wednesday, whatever. It's always December 25th, right? And that is a fixed feast. What the Greeks did is that they shifted the calendar from the Julian to the Gregorian for the fixed feasts. So Christmas for the Greeks is the same as Christmas in the Western Church, which follows the Gregorian or the new calendar. We have the same Christmas, but not if you're a Serb or if you are a Russian, because you follow the old calendar, the Julian calendar. Christmas is 13 days later. It's actually January 7th. It's not the 25th. It's 13 days later. Okay, there's that problem. What about the movable feast? What's a movable feast? Well, the Feast of Pascha, of Easter, for all the churches, including the Protestants and Catholics, it's not the same day every year, right? It's not like April 12th, whether it's a Wednesday or a Sunday or Tuesday, right? No. It's calculated as always a Sunday after a particular series of things happens. It's the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox or the spring equinox. Why do you have this calculation? It had to do with how Passover was calculated. And Easter occurred by Passover. Now, today, Passover is not part of the calculation, but it's used. They use the way the early church chose to do this, both in the East and West. That's a movable feast. But if you have a calendar that doesn't calculate the spring equinox properly, your movable feast will be at a different time than a calendar that calculates it properly. Okay. So again, the Western calendar, and here I'm just laying it out, is much more accurate. But when Pascha shifts, it's because we're using a calendar that doesn't really calculate the vernal equinox properly. That's why our movable feasts are offset. We are old calendar for the movable feasts. Besides Pascha, other feasts are connected to Pascha. The Ascension, because it's 40 days after Pascha. So you calculate Ascension depending on when you calculate Pascha, right? And Pentecost. Pentecost is always 50 days after Pascha. So these are movable feasts. I say all of this because it led to another break in Orthodox Church communities. Groups known as old calendarists, who refused to accept the new calendar that the Greeks embraced, and new calendarists that the Greeks and those churches that aligned with the Greek churches accept. And it's still an ongoing problem for us. Okay. The Orthodox had in America a primate who was Athenagoras, and ultimately he was elected to become ecumenical patriarch too, which is really cool. And he met with Pope Paul, and he did some really great global stuff. Right? Other things are happening, and I'm not going to go through the slide, but the two things I want you to note are the founding of the theological schools, Holy Cross in 1937 and St. Vladimir's and St. Tikhon in 38. That's important because now we are training our own priests here in America. Right? Here are some pictures of the seminaries. Holy Cross is that one over there. The middle one is St. Vladimir's, and the other one over here is St. Tikhon's. St. Vladimir's in New York, and St. Tikhon's is in blanking on it. You can look it up. All right. Although by the mid-50s, let's say the mid-20th century, the Orthodox Church was getting, pretty established schools, structures, cathedrals, educational programs, church schools as well as seminaries, a lot of really sort of independent work being done here. If you think about how they were viewed by the mother churches, the Orthodox here were still considered to be the diaspora. Diaspora is the mindset that you have a homeland and you can disperse, you can spread from the homeland, and you still belong somewhere else. Now there's a lot of truth to that, because Orthodox, whether you Greek or Russian, etc., have a great affinity for the ancestral. But what does it mean when your children are born here and your grandchildren are born here and they're marrying people who are born here and who have no ethnic ties? How do you call yourself a diaspora? Aren't you a community here? The other ones is a church here. So there was a discord between the mindset of those people who are like, we're no longer a diaspora, and those who are like, no, we really are. And I remember being told by a hierarch that we should send our, when I wasn't 10, I was like 40, and it was saying you should send your church to Greece to breathe the air of Greece because they're true Greeks, and I'm like, well, my kids are American. That's how they understand, that's how they identify. Yes, Greek heritage, and they love it and they're proud of it, and you can celebrate that, but they also celebrate the 4th of July as their Independence Day, not March 25th. My husband's Greek. He's born in Greece. Right? So yeah, Independence Day is much bigger for him, but not for so born here. The children are born here. So it's a matter of I'm not saying one's better or worse. It's just, it causes tension, right? All right. So that's part of what the issues that the Orthodox in America face. The question of diaspora. They were very good at caring for their own people. They were centers of religious but social life. They consolidated in geographic areas. They tended to the needs of the immigrants. But at the beginning, and even now, because we have waves of immigrants coming in, that's still being addressed. But you have to ask yourself, are you being a real mission church? Are you being a church here in America? Okay. So I'm going to do some positives and some negatives. Okay. This intertwining of ethnic and religious identity had served the Orthodox churches well through the many centuries of Turkish domination, right? Preserving faith and culture. But in the new home now, this mindset had some consequences, and that is resistance to unity, administrative and ecclesiastical unity. Guess what? There are canons in the church, laws of the church that say that you are supposed to have only one hierarch in a city, not 12, okay, or whatever, 6. How many we ever? I mean, you can have a lot of bishops. You have the bishop of Skokie and the bishop of Lake Forest and the bishop of, but there shouldn't be 4 bishops who are bishops of Chicago, okay, because then they're competing with each other. One church, that's what the church canons say. You're one church in each place you are at. Okay, one administrative church. So we're not really living up to the idea of ecclesiastical administrative unity. Not much concern for mission with this mindset. Not much engagement with the wider society. Now, all of this is changing, I should say. And of course, there's a strong attachment to the worship and education. But people that were here began to work toward the emergence of American Orthodoxy, and that included many hierarchy movements. Back in 1960, the bishops here in the U.S. of all the different jurisdictions recognized the need to work towards unity and established something called SCOBA, the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the Americas. It ultimately changed over in 2010 to something called the Assembly of Canonical Bishops in America. But the good news is they meet, they talk about common problems, they try to work towards some sort of sense of unity in certain things. And starting in 65, as long ago as that, he began to appeal to the mother churches to help them find a process or a way to establish unity. All right, but we have still ways of integration. What else is happening? The Orthodox is moving into this public sphere, addressing questions such as racism and abortion and some of the other more current issues of the day. You have Martin Luther King walking in Selma, and there is Archbishop Jacobus, the Greek Orthodox hierarch of South America, who walked with them. And he got a lot of flack for that, by the way, but he went with them. You have Orthodox Christians for Life, who do go to Washington, D.C. every year to protest abortion. And this is the first picture of SCOBA back in 1960. All right. As I mentioned before, in 1970, OCA, used to be the Metropolitan Church, since independence, it actually becomes now an autocephalous church in the United States. Of course, it takes the name of the Orthodox Church in America, and it kind of rankles some of the other Orthodox communities because they're like, well, it sounds like you're the only one, and we're here too. So there was a little tension, and the Ecumenical Patriarch never granted their autocephaly, never recognized it. Why? Well, they used to belong to Russia, so they went to Russia and asked Russia for their autocephaly. But the Ecumenical Patriarch says that they're the ones who actually grant autocephaly, and they didn't give it. So it's a canonical anomaly. You technically don't recognize them, but we totally share sacraments, worship, everything else. So it's sort of, it's one of these, it'll happen, but it's still being processed. There are many movements to seek unity and move out into America. And these things now are these pan-Orthodox associations or fellowships that are established. The one for college students, OCF, Christian Fellowship. Started in 65, disbanded, started in 2001. The Orthodox Christian Mission Center in 1985. Amazing work that they do to bring the Orthodox faith into various territories, especially Africa. And the second place was in Soviet regions where it had been completely wiped out. International Orthodox Christian Charities, IOCC. Of course, Catholic charities, nobody can touch them. They're just so huge and they do such phenomenal work. But let me tell you, IOCC has done so much to assist people in various times of crisis. And it's non-denominational, and they go out and do across either the nation here or globally. Yes, they went to Turkey. They're there now, helping to clean up and rebuild. And they have been in Ukraine. It's not this whole war. So IOCC is really working diligently. We had a meeting in 1994 where the bishops voted to terminate the language and mindset of diaspora and work for unity. And then, as I said, in 2010, SCOBA turns into the Assembly of the Episcopal Assembly in Central America. And here you see the work of OCMC, you see the work of IUCC, all over the world, Orthodox Christians to do these things and assist them. And lots of other things happening. Orthodox Theological Society of America. I'm secretary of this group, but we've been around for like 35 years. It's an association of all the Orthodox theologians. And the CAPA, the Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. Rand Anderson, who's very active at St. Peter and Paul here, is the president currently of our CAPA. OCL, Orthodox Christian Laity. Many Orthodox people from St. Peter and Paul founded OCL. George Caucasus, George Ponticus, other people that you might know here. We're active in them. The Orthodox Christian Prison Ministry, Deacon Ted Zacharidis is very active in them. And other. Peace Fellowship, Project Mexico, and there are photos of various some of these. And you see the work being done. It shows you that Orthodox in America has taken this step forward as to take its place as a presence, a sustained and permanent presence in the United States. It's not all easy. There's still challenges here. Okay. So one of the biggest problems that we face today doesn't come from anything happening in the US. In fact, we've been the place where the greatest peace has been maintained, but globally, the ecumenical patriarch and the Moscow patriarch well, let me put it this way. They are in the Moscow patriarch excommunicated the ecumenical patriarch back in 2019. He said that he is no longer in communion with him. He will not share communion. His people are not to share communion with the people who are under the ecumenical patriarch. So there's really, it's the nuclear bomb, right? There's nothing worse you can do. And it's all about, it has everything to do with what happened in Ukraine. The ecumenical patriarch gave the Ukrainian Orthodox Church its autocephaly or independence from the Moscow patriarch. The Moscow patriarch said, that wasn't yours to give. You shouldn't have done that. And just multiple things have happened since then. It has permeated the relations of all the other patriarchates with each other. And one thing, for example, that the Moscow patriarch has been doing, and I'm going to just be out there, with the what could you actually call him a heresiarch? Okay, a patriarch who is acting in such a way that he is unfaithful to the traditions of the church and should no longer be a patriarch. But part of what he's doing is he's using the power and influence and money of the Moscow patriarch to intimidate the other patriarchs. The church in the Patriarch of Alexandria, which runs Africa, were dependent on a lot of funds from Moscow because Moscow is very supportive of mission in Africa. And because the Patriarch of Alexandria sided with the ecumenical patriarch on this issue, they withdrew the money and then began to establish their own jurisdictions separate from the Patriarch of Alexandria in Africa, and then bring churches and priests under their administrative rule. So what you're setting up in Africa that didn't exist before, and they did that in Korea. There's an Orthodox church in Korea. They did this in Korea too. They set up a rival Orthodox community to the one that has been there forever. Okay? And they have the money and the power to do it. And they're trying to do it in Constantinople, Istanbul too. Okay? There's a lot going on globally. And we get into the problem with the so the Russian churches here are of three main types. There's the OCA, which is independent, but had been in communion with Moscow. One has to decide, you stay in communion with the ecumenical patriarch who hasn't really officially recognized you, or are you going to stick with the Moscow patriarch? But still in. So they've been in a very difficult situation and they're trying to navigate. Some of their priests feel that they haven't operated bold enough. They need to stand up and more courageously, oppose the Moscow patriarch. They're still doing that kind of, they're trying to be in communion with everybody. There's that. There are those who are, there's a few parishes that are directly under the Moscow patriarch, and they are still loyal to him. And there are a few under the Moscow patriarch is operating in a rogue manner that's inappropriate. And then there is Rokor, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which for a long time had broken from Moscow when it was under the Soviets. And it was only when it was free again that they reunited. But they did reunite with Kirill, the current patriarch, as the guy that brokered this reunion. And they're very conservative community, and they find a lot that resonates with them, with what the Moscow church is trying to do. So they're in conflict. There are definitely some people in Rokor who are like, we rejected Moscow into the Soviets. This is just as bad. We have to, speak as it is, and but there are others who are staying loyal to Moscow. So the Russians are in turmoil. It's very difficult right now for different Russian churches, trying to figure it out. And the other Orthodox are, the Greeks are very clear where they stand. They support Ukraine. They are, standing with the ecumenical patriarch for the most part. But we still want America to be the place where we can all worship together in peace and try to let that be what's going on. We were there. People. So it was the first year when the split happened. There's a Sunday of Orthodoxy that the Orthodox celebrate. It's the first Sunday of Lent. That's when we carry all the icons around. You know that one where you carry all the icons around? It's the time when Orthodox, it's called the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and it's when all the Orthodox are supposed to affirm their unity. And in fact, that's the one day that all the Orthodox jurisdictions get together for what they call a pan-Orthodox Vespers. And the first year that the ecumenical patriarch and the Moscow patriarch split back in 2019, before COVID hit, there were two Vespers. The ones with the Serbs and the Russians, and the ones with the Greeks and the Antiochians. Sunday of Orthodox unity, we were disunited. And that didn't sit well with anyone. So the next year, we said, forget that. We'll worship together. And we'll let the patriarchs work it out. But you can't say that this isn't affected the communities here. It's like everything else is taking a back seat until these things get worked out. All right. Yeah. Oh, so the interesting thing is the ecumenical patriarch did not excommunicate the Moscow Patriarch. It's unilateral. The Moscow Patriarch says you can't go to a Greek church and get communion. The Ecumenical Patriarch didn't tell the Greeks they can't go to a Russian and get communion. So as a Greek Orthodox, I can walk into a Russian Orthodox church under the Moscow Patriarch, and my patriarch's fine with it. Now, that priest might look at me and say, "You're Greek, get out of here." That's the best thing. That's the best. You've learned your lessons well. But yes, yeah. So where this became extremely problematic is Mount Athos. Why? Because there are actually, besides the Greek monasteries up there, there are ethnic monasteries. There's a Serbian monastery. There's a Russian monastery. And what do? They're all monks living on Mount Athos, and now they're not supposed to have communion with each other. This was really problematic. And but they're also the ones who are like most obedient. So of course they're not. Monks have been known to be like rebellious today. So at this point, though, basically what the Russian Patriarch did, he says, because the monks were very upset, he said truce on Mount Athos. Truce on Mount Athos. So they do communion on Mount Athos. So there's this schism that's a problem, and it's just continually impacting us all the time. The next questions we have are, if you establish an independent, self-governing, unified Orthodox Church here, what will the relation with the mother churches be? We still need to connect with them. They need support. You think the Ecumenical Patriarch is anybody to help them live and function except for the churches outside of Turkey? There's nothing left in Turkey. There's a few hundred people left in Turkey. It's the churches here in the United States and abroad that are important. So how do you care for the mother church, right? And what about those unique and special ethnic expressions? Nobody wants to just eliminate them, like they don't matter. They're beautiful, they're special. But again, do they become the predominant factor? Do they become an obstacle to people coming into the faith? And if they become an obstacle, then how are they really part of the Christian mission? They should be something that is there and present, but not predominant. And then we still have to figure out the calendar issue, which besides the calendar issue, we have different calendars. We have different bank accounts. We have different facilities. How do you do a unified Orthodox Church when you have Greeks who are quite wealthy and then you have Serbians who are not? Do they always feel like they're going to be second class, like their voices aren't heard properly, that they have to somehow, they'd rather just stay where they're at? Why would they want to join with us if they're going to be eclipsed? What about education in terms of, the theological schools? Again, those are the Greek and Russian schools, but the other big that are there, tiny. And are their voices lost? So we have to figure out all of these things. Okay. Benefit. Sharing of resources, pooling of resources, especially as everything gets more expensive, as populations decline in the Greek churches, we can actually assist one another. We will become more present in the American life, if we have one voice. I'll tell you, on 9/11, they had a big prayer service at the cathedral in Washington, D.C. Now, the prayer service that I watched had all kinds of Christian communities. They had a rabbi and had a Muslim imam. What they didn't have was an Orthodox hierarchy. And the only church that was destroyed in 9/11, as you might know, was a Greek Orthodox church. Okay? So what happened? And eventually the Greeks were brought in, the Orthodox were brought in to offer prayers, etc. But at that point, the thing is, which one do you ask? Because there's so many, and you ask one and the others get upset. So either you ask everybody or you ask nobody. And the end result is that we have no presence, no voice. Okay. As I told you before, the canonical status is incorrect. We need to address that. Mission, by unification, we will be able to missionize the faithful here in America better, and express the Orthodox faith in the language and culture of the native land. So I have a few slides that envision what we could look like as a Orthodox and American. It doesn't mean we're not ethnic, but it also means that American identity has a place. We have people of all ages and different cultures and different races. You might recognize this place. That's St. Paul, and that's Nathaniel. Father Rick is not wearing the hat. Father Rick, I love it that the two deacons are wearing these hats, and they're not, but whatever. What about our children? What are we getting to the next generation? That's what this question was. And then what I have here is ideas that we are supposed to be the enlighteners of the world, passing the light of Christ to the world around us. And that is St. Hieronymus on Pascha night. If you've ever been to St. Hieronymus, when they celebrate Pascha, everybody goes out. There are people who stay in the church, but the vast majority go outside. And the light is passed around outside. And shoot off fireworks. So, and that's a very good thing to do. They shoot off fireworks and it is so jubilant. The bells are just pealing. But somebody took that as a drawing. But that's a great expression of how orthodoxy can go into the world. So it's 10:09. So further questions about the way we have here in one thing I don't have in the slides, and that is the whole plus and minus of people who are converts, people who are coming to Orthodoxy, who are not have no background in the Orthodox home country traditions. People, of course, there's through marriage, or relationships with people because a spouse is Orthodox, but we have a lot of people who are entering the Orthodox Church completely without any connection to family or spouses. They are entering it because they discover and they find it to speak to them as a true faith. Or, and this is something to be aware of and to take into consideration. And the or is that some are entering the Orthodox Church as a way of finding refuge from the incredibly rapid changes that are occurring in other Christian communities. And they are looking for something that is much more conservative and traditionalist and slow moving. But many times when people enter, and a lot of those people who have entered as converts, they're deeply interested in the theology and teaching of the church and go on to be ordained as priests or to take on positions of teaching and authority within the Orthodox Church. For example, at St. Vladimir is a convert. We have actually many UCA who are from the Episcopal Church or the Lutheran Church. It could be a great thing because these are people who choose to be Orthodox. But it can be a problem too, because sometimes people bring baggage. They bring fears and anxieties and they see problems that maybe aren't real, but come from their own trauma. So that's been a question, especially for people involved in theological education, to address. But we do see this tendency towards a certain kind of conservatism among some people who are in the church. And again, the church is, traditionally in all the best senses, trying to pass down the faith. And that is what we shall continue to do. But sometimes people who are new to the faith interpret things in certain ways that the people who are cradle orthodox don't see, and we can pay attention to that. So, any questions or concerns, or you want to address? And if I said something that upset or offended you, I would love to hear about it and not hear it in your evaluation. If you can say it to me directly, that'd be great. But otherwise,
I have a question.
Yeah.
On this issue of being in line with the canon and jurisdiction problems of America and all that, isn't there a canon for the Orthodox laity supposed to be a parishioner at the church closest to? Is that
you're
a
supposed to
real
be
canon?
a parishioner.
Yeah, you're supposed to go to the church closest to your home,
Mhm.
as opposed to like
Yeah,
driving
that's
50 miles because you're Serbian and you stand,
yeah.
the Greek church,
Yeah.
Arabic.
So the canons express it in various ways, because they really didn't come from the canons were not written in a time where anybody with any kind of, you couldn't travel far quickly, right? So you wouldn't have like somebody traveling 50 miles back and forth to the church. But what they did say is you are to go to your local church. The church is local. In other words, you are to be in the church of your city, of your space. Again, that can be interpreted a little bit differently in terms of, neighborhood. But if you go to the home world countries, for example, you would not go to a different village to attend church. You attended the church in your village. And there might be 4 different churches in your village, but the community attended only one at any given time. My husband grew up in a village in the mountains of Greece. And yeah, they had like 4 churches, but this church was used like 3 times a year. This church was their main church. That church was used for certain feasts. Okay, also. So, and everybody went to the church that was up there because there was actually only one priest. So there was only going to be one service. And so that would be, and they had a small village. So the next village over was a different church with a different priest if they could manage a different priest. So yes, the idea of not traveling to a different location because you like the priest better, or you like the service that's in a different language or whatever, is that idea of shopping for parishes is certainly not part of any of the canons of the church. In fact, the opposite is true. You should understand your church as being the local family of Christians in the community in which you live. But it wasn't a reality that needed to be addressed in the same way. So part of our struggle is to update the canons to reflect our current reality. And would that be something that we would want to change or not? I mean, maybe we would want to maintain that idea because really it enables people to think of themselves as a unit, as a whole body, as opposed to just simply. The other one is very like you have a shopper's mentality, and Orthodoxy, the Orthodox faith, Christian faith, is not about you picking everything, but rather you receiving what God has given. And part of that is obedience, learning how to except with Thanksgiving, as opposed to always being in charge and control. So it's a very good question, John. Yeah.
I know Teddy grew up in Schaumburg, but his mom would bring him to St. Peter and Paul, but he said sometimes he didn't like that because you didn't know anybody at your high school
I
that.
hear because she grew up here and my grandma's still there. So I guess would still be the sense of community. For people, but that's, I didn't know any
You can make a lot of
other
friends.
church people, right?
That can be very, very hard and isolating.
Yeah.
And honestly, studies have shown that if you don't make those connections and friends, you have a much lower likelihood of actually maintaining participation in the church. So the idea is that the people who baptize you should be at this, the same church. Well, that ship sailed a while ago, you have people. So,
There's so many people.
and unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, because it actually gives you options, but it does not preserve unity. And I've heard priests even say, because there was a woman who was complaining that the priest had too much Greek. And I don't like it. There's another church 10 minutes down the road that does more English. Go there. I'm like, what kind of an answer is that for a priest to give? But well, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where 2 of my 3 girls are, there is one Greek Orthodox church, but it's also like the only Orthodox church. There's an OCA in the northern hills, but that is newer and not where most of the people, so it is a multicultural, multi-ethnic parish. Absolutely. And when they come to the Lord's Prayer, you better hang on, because the priest, anybody want to say it in any language, you can get up and say it, and you have to sit through all the different Lord's Prayers. But they do it in Arabic, in Greek, in Russian, in Spanish. I think that's it, but there might be another language in there too. That's not just on Agape Sunday, where you hear all the epistles and all the gospel in all the languages. That's every Sunday. So it is definitely a sense of the Orthodox faithful form one community there. So, and their chanting is almost all in English, because that's the language they all share. And the priest does it mostly in English too. So anyway. All right, guys, it's 9 o'clock. Unless you have a burning question, I say let's go. Okay. Thank you again. Thank you, guys. All right. Well, like I said, chocolate is my favorite, so that's what it was going to be no matter what. All right.